Hello everyone, Dr. Mad here. Let's get mad about the English language. So, I'm going to start with a brief overview of the dates and technicalities, but just to say that this channel is a literature channel, not so much a history channel or a linguistics channel. Linguistics means the scientific study of languages, but this channel is more interested in literature. So what I'm going to do is I will go through the dates and the technicalities, but then we're going to actually look at some of the best examples that demonstrate these different periods of the English language. So I'll start on this side and then I'll go through this side as well. So English is an Indo-European language. Indo means Indian. It can also refer to Iran. So that may sound strange, but basically that's a fact. So English is an Indo-European language, and that kind of feeds into the Germanic family of languages. So English is a Germanic language, and then that kind of went into Old Frisian, which is an Old Dutch language. So down here we have the main names for these different periods of English. And on the left here, we have the various people and various other influences on the language. So here we have the Celts, who were the original inhabitants of these isles, and they had their own language. And the Romans came along with their influence, which was Latin. And indirectly, through the Latin, they also brought in Greek influences. And all of that kind of fed into the first English language, which we call Old English, which was mainly Anglo-Saxon English. So Angles, Saxons, Jutes, these were various tribes that came into these islands, and also the Vikings. And then we have the Normans coming in, 1066, the Battle of Hastings, William the Conqueror, and they brought in French influences. And actually, for a time, there were two languages in these islands. Well, actually, there were probably many, but the two main ones. And the upper class spoke French, the lower classes spoke English. And anyway, the Old English so transformed itself into what we call Middle English. And then that goes into early modern English. Now, here we have what we call the Great Vowel Shift. And what happened here was that long vowel sounds became shorter, and also some of the letters became silent. So the best example of that is the word knife. So originally that was pronounced knief, but the long E sound became shortened to the I sound, and the K disappeared, resulting in knife. So if you've ever wondered why English spelling is so different to the way it's pronounced, this was probably the main reason, or this is the main reason. But it's not the only reason. Obviously, the influences of these other languages also is a factor. And then we've got the English Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance started in Florence in Italy between 1300 and 1500. You can't be too exact with these dates. And it then spread throughout Europe and obviously here as well in England and Britain. You also had the effect of international trade, different people meeting, and new words coming in that were to do with trade. Okay, so that's all resulting here into early modern English, and then that evolves into late modern English. And here, kind of similar to this, the Industrial Revolution also brings in new words, for example, to do with factories and manufacturing. And also what's happening here now is that English is being spread across the world through colonialism and the British Empire. And finally, we end up with the English of today, which also has the influences of technology and jargon and slang. So the main examples of that being computers, computing, computer science, the internet, social media. So if we have a look on this side now, so 450 AD, English begins, and what we call Old English, all the way to 1150 AD. So a long period there, about 700 years. But as we go through, you'll notice that the periods become shorter and shorter. And then we end up with Middle English here between 1150 and 1450. And also here, 1400, the great vowel shift begins. So we talked about that here. And it's evolving into early modern English around about 1450 to late modern English to 1750. And then from about 1750 or 1800, essentially we have modern English. Now, some people round these numbers up to the nearest 100, but if you kind of look around and research, you'll find that the 50 is actually more of a consensus. So we have modern English all the way to 2000 and all the way to now, but from around 2000 or maybe 1980, you can also talk about global English, which is slightly different to kind of this thing here, okay, and you'll see what I mean by that later on. So here I've tried to simplify things, but you can see it's still a little bit complicated, isn't it? Still a bit confusing. So here I've tried to simplify it even further. So we've got 450, Old English begins, to 1150, and then to 1450 we've got Middle English, and then from between 1450 and 1750 we've got the early modern starting here, and then ending up with late modern. And then from here, basically, it's modern English, which is why I've put the word late in brackets there. And then 2000, and then we've got global English there. Okay, so as I mentioned, that's an overview of the dates and the technicalities. But what I really want to do in this video is to look at the different periods by looking at some of the best examples of literature that demonstrate those periods, but also these are pieces of literature, works of literature that are interesting in their own right, and hopefully after watching this video you will want to explore them further and read them if you haven't done so already. So the first example we're going to look at is Beowulf. So that's Old English, 450 to 1150. We don't know the author, and we don't know exactly when it was written, approximately 700 to 1000 AD. There are earlier examples of Old English, for example, Caedmon's Hymn, which is a small poem, and there's a link to that in the description section if you want to read that. But Beowulf is the first kind of long, complete piece of English literature in Old English. Now, when we look at this, we can see that it makes no sense at all. It's like a foreign language. Let's try reading it out loud to see if that makes a difference. Hwet, we gadena in gedagam, piatzininga prim gefranen, hu o apalingus ellen fremaden. So again, even when we say it out loud, it doesn't really make any sense. So most people don't understand Old English, but fortunately for us, there are some experts and professors out there who do. So let's have a look at these two translations. So we've got this one from 1910, Francis B. Gummere, and this one from 1999, Seamus Heaney. So Seamus Heaney is a great Irish poet He won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and actually this book, this translation, won a major prize as well. Let's see if we can compare these versions and see what comes out. So this one, lo, praise of the prowess of people kings, of spear-armed Danes in days long sped, we have heard, and what honour the Athelings won. So, the spear Danes in days gone by, and the kings who ruled them had courage and greatness. We have heard of those princes' heroic campaigns. So let's start with these two words here, lo and so. So on the one hand, you might think they're totally different, but on the other hand, actually, it doesn't matter because these, in both cases, this word doesn't really mean anything. It's just a way of starting. So remember, back in the day, these would probably have been verbally told, orally told. Okay, so you kind of needed a way of starting. If we look at this word here, Danes and Danes, so that's the same. Here we've got spear Danes. Here we've got spear-armed Danes. So that's kind of similar. And the final thing we'll look at is this word here, Athelings. Now, if you look that up, you will find that word in the dictionary, unlike most of the other words from here, okay, or even from there. But Seamus Heaney has chosen to translate that word even further to make it even easier for us. So, yeah, if you look this word up, you'll find that it means prince or princes, right? So there we are there. But the main point to be made here is that if you pause the video and read the rest of this, and actually, hopefully, if you go and read this whole version, you will find that it's a very interesting read. It's just an adventure story about this great hero, Beowulf, fighting this monster, Grendel. So obviously, you can probably infer there the idea of a battle between good and evil, perhaps. And the point being that when we look at this, it looks really off-putting, doesn't it? And it kind of maybe gives the impression that if you try to read Beowulf, it'll be difficult or boring, but it's not if you read a modern translation. Okay, so that's Beowulf. Now let's move on to Middle English, 1150 to 1450. And Geoffrey Chaucer, the Canterbury Tales, is the best example of that. So that's around about 1400. We are sure about that date, but it actually took about 10, 13 years to actually write. So at first glance, again, this still seems quite confusing, although not as much as Beowulf. But let's try reading it and see if it makes any more sense than Beowulf. When that April, with his surest suit, the drought of March hath perched to the root, and bathed every vein in switch liquor, of which whereto engendered is the flower. So there we can see that it does make a lot more sense than Beowulf, although not complete sense. So, for example, that's the same as when as now, except it's got A instead of E. April is the same, except it's got double L instead of one. That's the same. This is confusing. And then this word here, if you just look at it, it looks different and confusing. But when you say it out loud, drought, you suddenly realize, oh, it means when there's no rain, right? So that's a reminder that language is verbal, it's oral, okay? When we write it down, it's just a representation, and there are so many different ways that you could write it down. Of March, that's easy, and hath, I think most people could work out that means has. Perched to the root. So this is basically the same, except take out the E, so you got root. And bathed, every... Now this word, if you look at that, it looks different, but when you say it out loud, you're thinking, okay, so that means vein as in V-E-I-N. So not the ones in human beings, but the ones in plants. In switch liqueur, now that sounds like liquor, alcohol, so that wouldn't make sense in terms of rain, but at least it is a liquid, right? So maybe, and in fact, liquor, that also could be liquid, couldn't it? Of which whereto engendered is the flower. So whereto, now it does help to know some European languages. So if you know a little bit of French, for example, you know that verd means green. So that's probably means green. Engendered means to start. Now, this word looks familiar, and actually, that's something to be wary of because that can be misleading as well. Because the look of that might suggest that it means what you cook with, right? But actually, when you say it out loud, flower, and if you combine that with rain, it must mean the flowers that grow in the ground. And Zephyrus is like zephyr. Okay, it's not a very common word, but I know that that means it's to do with the winds or like a soft, gentle breeze or the west wind. Eke with his sweet breath. So again, that looks a bit confusing, but when you say it out loud, you can see it's actually not that difficult. And then just jumping ahead here, tender crops. So crops means things that grow. So there we can see that it is actually, with a bit of effort, you can actually make more sense of it than you could with Beowulf. Let's see if the actual translation is, if we're anywhere on the right track. So here we have a modern translation from Harvard University. So these are the original lines and these are the translations. When April with its sweet smelling showers has pierced the drought of marsh to the root and bathed in every vein of the plants in such liquid by which power the flower is created, when the west wind also with its sweet breath in every wood and field has breathed life into the tender new leaves, and the young sun has run half its course in Aries. So hopefully you can see that we were on the right track there. I mean, I'll be honest and say it wasn't my first attempt at translating, but I tried to replicate my first attempt. So, and it's, hopefully you can see that it's quite good fun to try and do that. It's almost like a detective story. Okay, let's move on now to early modern English, 1450 to 1750. And Hamlet, so William Shakespeare, and Hamlet is one of his most famous plays. And the approximate date is actually very similar to the actual date. We reckon it's between 1599 and 1601. Now, obviously, it does help to know what the story is about. So Hamlet is about a young prince whose father has been murdered by his uncle, and the uncle has then married Hamlet's mother. So it's about murder, it's about incest. So a similar point to be made about Shakespeare as with Canterbury Tales and Beowulf is that people think Shakespeare is difficult, and he is, but just remember that he writes about very interesting things. He writes about murder and romance and all kind of things like that. In fact, sorry, just going back to Canterbury Tales for a moment, the point I wanted to make there was that if you read the Canterbury Tales, a modern translation, it's very entertaining. Chaucer is a funny, entertaining writer. He writes about ordinary people and their relationships. So that's kind of one of the main points I'm trying to make here in this video, that initially the look of the language can put us off, but if you find some modern translations or you just make a bit of an effort, they're actually very readable and very entertaining. Okay, so let's have a look at Hamlet. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. So what you'll see there is that none of the words are actually difficult. What makes Shakespeare a bit more difficult actually is the fact that he writes in a very poetic manner, and he uses lots of imagery. So that's really what makes it a bit more difficult. Not so much the language, although there is an element of that. So that's the point to make, that you need to read Shakespeare in the same way as you would poetry. Okay. So as you can imagine, Hamlet is in a suicidal state. That's what this first line means, to be or not to be. Should he live or should he kill himself? And this tis is short for it is. Nobler in this sense means, is it better for me to suffer in my mind, mentally, emotionally? And this is obviously a metaphor for all the terrible things. So here's personification here, that fate is throwing at me. And in this case, he's talking about his uncle murdering his father and then marrying his mother. Or should I fight physically? Should I take up arms? And in this case, it would have meant maybe a sword, obviously not guns. And by fighting his uncle and either killing him or being killed, put an end to his troubles. So hopefully you can see there that the idea of going through these different texts partly is to show that, for example, with Shakespeare, he's actually not that difficult if you compare him to Chaucer and Beowulf. Now, you can get modern translations. The most famous one is the No Fear translations. Now, some people are a bit kind of look down their noses at a little bit at these translations, but I don't think there's anything wrong with them. So they have the original on one side and the modern on the other. And what you're meant to do is use the modern to help you understand what's going on, but you mustn't just read the modern. In the case of Shakespeare, that would be completely pointless, okay? Unlike Chaucer and Beowulf, with Shakespeare, if you just read the modern, it's pointless, because the whole point of Shakespeare is his use of language, his imagery. That's what makes him so brilliant, okay? So just use the modern to understand the original, and it's the original that you really need to be reading. Okay, so let's move on now to late or modern English. And a great example of that is Jane Austen. Now, notice one other thing. This is the first female author. Now, I could have chosen Charles Dickens and all kinds of other writers. I deliberately chose a female author. Unfortunately, up to this point, it's been all men because there was no other alternative. So, Pride and Prejudice is one of her most famous novels, but she's written so many famous ones, and they've all been turned into films. So that was approximately 1800, and it's actually 1813. And as you can see there, Jane Austen is perfectly readable, not difficult at all. Some of the other writers at that time were maybe a bit more difficult, but that probably just to do with style. And here we have one of the most famous opening lines in literature. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. And then if we turn to the next page, I'm not going to read through this, but what's interesting about literature is that by reading it, you find out what society was like at the time that piece of work or that work was written. And if you read Jane Austen, it's all about marriage and young women trying to find a husband, because in those days, that was kind of the only choice they had. They weren't really allowed to work. They were financially dependent on men. And notice here that this first question they ask about this person who's being introduced is he married or single? Okay, so moving on now to the final example. So global English, and the best example of that is Salman Rushdie, Midnight Children, approximately 2000 AD, so actually 1981. So I won't read through all this. I was born in the city of Bombay, once upon a time. No, that won't do. There's no getting away from the date. I was born in Dr. Nalika's nursing home on August the 15th, 1947. So as you might be able to work out there, that it's about the independence of India. But I'm just going to skip to this line here. I, Salim Sinai, later variously called Snot-Nose, Stained-Face, Baldy, Sniffer, Buddha, and even Piece of the Moon, had become heavily embroiled in fate. So embroiled means to get mixed up in a difficult situation. So what we notice here is the introduction of non-English names, but more importantly is for this thing here, Piece of the Moon. So that's from a Hindi phrase, Chand ka tukra. Chand means moon, tukra means piece. So can you see here how the language is how the languages are mixing up, how these foreign phrases are coming into the English language. So this book won the Booker Prize in 1981, and in fact, it won the Booker of Bookers. In other words, people voted that it was the best out of all the Booker Prize winners. So if you're interested in the history of English language and literature, then you really can't avoid this book. Okay, so that's a quick, brief overview of the English language told through some of the best examples. I hope you enjoyed that. And if you want to pursue some of these things further, you'll find the links below in the description section. So Beowulf, we looked at these two translations. So this one is available on poetryfoundation.org, and Seamus Heaney, obviously from bookshops. Canterbury Tales, you've got the original on Gutenberg. And then one of the earlier translations by Harvard University. And then Peter Ackroyd, he's a modern writer. He's written a really nice version of Canterbury Tales, and that's from bookshops. And then Hamlet and Shakespeare. I mean, there's hundreds of websites where you can find the Shakespeare plays, but I find these ones the easier ones to follow, strangely enough, even though this is the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And then Pride and Prejudice and all the Jane Austen novels on Gutenberg. So notice Gutenberg, it's a treasure trove. It's got thousands of free books, novels, non-fiction, poetry. And then finally, Midnight Children, you can get from the Internet Archive or from bookshops. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed that video. Please find the links below in the description section if you want to pursue those areas further. So thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed that video, please do subscribe and tell all your friends.